Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our guest of honor, Mr. Mohamed Alhabshi, the first gentleman of the Republic of Singapore and the patron of the Arab Network at Singapore, and our guest speaker for today, Mr. George Yeo.
Mr. Alhabshi, Mr. Yeo, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good day to all of you. I am Afifa Al-Sri and this is Muhammad Bahajaj. We are from the Youth Collective of Arab Network at Singapore, also known as ANAS, and we will be your MCs for today. We would also like to thank our sponsor that made today's event very much possible, HMR Consultant, along with support from NUS Malay Studies Department, and also our venue supporter for today, Asian Civilization Museum.
To kickstart our event, we will begin with an instrumental performance of the string instrument we Singaporean Hadramis here call gambus, but known in the Middle East as oud. This taksim or musical improvisation segment will be performed by Izzat Adnan from Espousal Fusion Entertainment. Izzat is our homegrown local talent who has traveled to Yemen, Indonesia, and even the US to sharpen his skills under world-renowned virtuosos like the Palestinian-American music composer Simon Shaheen. Performing alongside Izzat is our very talented oud player Khair Yassin. He's also a founding member of SG Oudist, a community dedicated to bringing oud and gambus music, its education and expression, into our day and age. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Izzat and Khair.
you, gentlemen, for that lovely performance. Without further ado, we would like to invite the President of ANAS, Madam Khadija Alatas, to give her opening remarks for today. Madam Khadija, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning and welcome. Mr. Mohamed Alhabshi, First Gentleman and Patron of the Arab Network at Singapore. Mr. George Yeo, our distinguished guest speaker. Your Excellencies and distinguished guests. And welcome to our book editors attending from the US, the book authors attending from Muscat in Oman, from Cairo in Egypt, and all our virtual guests dialing in from Singapore and overseas. Today, alhamdulillah, we are celebrating an event with many firsts. And the Arab Network at Singapore is delighted to host you today. The first time that a book is featuring the global Arab communities and the diaspora outside the Middle East and North Africa. An interesting mix of countries are being featured. The US, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Cuba, France, Germany, and Singapore. I also think the first launch of the book outside the US. Also the first time that the Singapore Hadhrami Arab community is being featured alongside other global Arab diasporas. First time that the Arab Network at Singapore is hosting a book launch. And the first time we are launching our 10th anniversary commemorative video for our decade of dedication. And so truly, the stars are aligned. The editors and the authors have put together a very rich, varied, poignant, and reflective contents for all of us to ponder. I'd like to share a touching quote from the book introduction. To anyone who has struggled to find a community and anyone that accepts the complexity of a truly cosmopolitan identity, may these chapters help you feel understood and inspire you to connect with other people and yourself. This quote resonates very deeply with us in Singapore as a minority ethnic community who embrace our migration, assimilation, and balancing the identity of race, nationality, and religion. The Peranakan or locally born Arabs of Singapore are truly distinct. Most of us are 4th and 5th generation. Many do not speak Arabic or have been to Yemen, yet we retain this consciousness of our identity via lineage, deliberate and continued self-identification from one generation to the next, and via social cultural association. It is this unique identity as proud Singaporean and equally proud Hadramis that binds us all together, we hope, as a force for doing good, to carry the legacy of our forefathers and continue to contribute towards nation building. We hope the activities we do at ANAS will resonate with our fellow Singaporeans to a better understanding of our multi-faith and multiracial society, something that should be celebrated and protected. Last but not least, I would be remiss not to mention that the Singapore chapter of the book was written by a young Omani diplomat who served her tenure in Singapore from 2011 to 2016 as Oman's Deputy Consul General. Aisha, Thank you for bringing the opportunity to feature Singapore into the book. Your intimate connections with the local Hadhrami community, your passion, support, and love will forever be cherished, as with your scholarly voice in the book. We miss you, and we wish you could have been here in person. I will end on this note. Thank you all once again for joining us today. Please sit back and enjoy the rest of the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Khadija, for that wonderful introduction. We are indeed very honored to have Mr. George Yeo here today to grace this event. Mr. Yeo is a senior advisor to both Quark Group and Kerry Logistics Network, and has previously served in the Singapore government as Minister of Information and Arts, Trade and Industry, Health, and Foreign Affairs. We are delighted to have him here today, along with many speakers and panelists. And now, may we please invite our esteemed guest speaker, Mr. Yeo, up on stage to give his keynote speech. Mr. Yeo, please.
Syed Mohamed Alhabshi, Excellencies, Arab friends, ladies and gentlemen. When Khadija invited me for this event, I was intrigued and honored to be asked to speak at an Arab event. Singapore is a land of multiple identities. We're always arguing about it, reflecting on it, never coming to an ultimate agreement. I don't think the ferment will ever stop. It stops when there's no more Singapore. And that's part of who we are. In the sense, an event like this, it's not only a reflection, it is a celebration of our multiple identities. Identities are very important to a human being. The more you disrespect a person's identity or identities, the more angry he becomes, and the more fiercely devoted he is to these identities. But when you respect his identity, then he becomes very relaxed, and he jokes about it, and it becomes less important. It is very strange what identity means to a person, and not to the person we're talking to, but what it means to ourselves. And we're always wrestling with conflicting poles. This book, Arab Worlds Beyond MENA, when I lived through it, I thought, oh, it covers not just Muslim Arabs, it covers Christian Arabs. So that completely opens up a new universe. I mean, we know Steve Jobs was Syrian. MENA, I think, was Syrian too, or Carlos Slim. But we, in Singapore, don't think of them as Arabs, because for us, Arabs must be Muslims. If they're not Muslims, it's a little hard to fit it into our mental construct. But I recall, of course, that when my youngest son had leukemia and did a bone marrow transplant, he went to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, which was founded by Danny Thomas. And Danny Thomas was a Maronite from Lebanon. And St. Jude has the staunchest supporter in the American, Lebanese, and Syrian associated charities. A powerful group, but non-Muslim. And in my mind, yes, my son was saved by these philanthropists. And today, St. Jude is probably the biggest charity in the US. But I don't think of St. Jude as an Arab institution. But in some ways it is. And an event like this, a book like this, should open our mind to new connections. For me, my links to the Arab world are strongest through the Hadhrami community. I took an early fascination to them and visited the Hadramaut in 2003 with Al-Beda. Although we spent only 2 days, 1 night there, it was very interesting. And we could see how so much of Southeast Asia is in the Hadramaut. So sambal belacan is common in most meals there. Many people wear batik. And the connection is not Singapore, it is Southeast Asia. Although Singapore is an important part of the story. Raffles, during the Napoleonic War, Napoleon occupied Holland, so the British, with Holland's agreement, occupied Java. So he was there for 5 years. And he noticed that in all the towns, the animating entrepreneurial spirit was Hadhrami. So when he was reluctant to leave Java, but they had to because that was the deal. So in Calcutta, he looked for an alternative spot to locate British interests and found Singapore. And to animate commercial life in Singapore, he got his friend Syed Omar Al-Junid to come over. And that seeded the Arab community. And where to plant them? Well, he said, well, put them next to the Istana. So you have the Arab Quarter. And it's interesting that today, Sultan Mosque, the Board of Trustees, 12 persons, 2 Malay, 2 Javanese, 2 Buginese, 2 North Indians, 2 South Indians, 2 Arabs. And as Khatijah said, the Arabs in Southeast Asia have been Parakananized because they intermarry. So in Ho Ying Sing's book, The Grace of Tarim, Syed Muhammad, I'll give you a copy just now. So he said, well, you know, the Sayyids came down here, the Sultans wanted to have offsprings who carried the Prophet's blood, so they got the daughters to marry Sayyids. So my question to Khadija when I met her is, are you married to a Sayyid? And she said, no. I said, I read from the book that traditionally Sayyids can marry non-Sayyids, but Sharifas are under pressure to marry Sayyids. And so in this way, you maintain a certain organic integrity. And I was reflecting, well, yes, now Sayyids inhabit our Istana. Singaporeans don't think like that. And maybe it's not PC to talk like that. But to me, it's wonderful. I mean, the Malaysian royal houses, the houses of Perlis, Terengganu, they are Hadramis. In Indonesia, which has a republican tradition, many of them drop the Sayyid name. But when you know the Sayyid and you talk about his ancestry, he comes alive. Ali Alatas was like an uncle to me, you know. I mean, he was very senior, very wise. He said, hey, when 2 Arabs quarrel, never get involved, you know. The moment you get involved, they'll both attack you. I thought that was very good advice, which I took care to observe when I was in the foreign ministry. We have concentric circles around ourselves. And sometimes we are sensitive, sometimes we are not. In Singapore, our ability to sense shades and differences make us what we are, and in fact drives the cultural arbitrage, which is at the heart of the Singapore economy. It links us to the Arabia, it links us to Southeast Asia, and through events through events like this, it links us to the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yeo, for that very enlightening speech. One of the main reasons why we are gathered here today is also to celebrate a very special time for Anas. 2021 marks our 10th year anniversary. Along with today's event, Anas has been championing Singaporean Arab identity, and we are extremely grateful to be part of and to give back to the community. And to briefly commemorate our 10th year, we would like to showcase the premiere of our Anas Decade of Dedication video. Sit back, relax, grab your virtual popcorns, and enjoy.
Honor every individual with access to opportunities and the right to live a life of dignity.
The Arab Network at Singapore, or ANAS, was formed in 2010 by a group of service-minded and dedicated volunteers from the Singapore Arab community. Our forefathers were traders and scholars who came from Hadhrami in Yemen. They have contributed their energy, skills, and resources to help build our nation and made Singapore their home. We are driven at ANAS by that same legacy, and so we work closely with local and international partners to enrich our communities. We do this through our focus on 4 core pillars.
ANAS treasures our Hadhrami Arab Peranakan heritage. We refer to it as a Peranakan heritage because our culture is a mixture or a melange of Hadhrami Arab culture as well as the local cultures that we find in the Malay world. We've been able to forge a mixture of these various cultures because we wanted to preserve the Hadhrami culture, those aspects that we found precious. At the same time, we wanted to assimilate those aspects of the local cultures that are important, useful, beneficial, but also beautiful to us. And we try to express our cultures in various ways, especially through music, dance, and of course, food.
ANAS believes that compassion is the bedrock of our humanity. Through our various humanitarian and welfare activities, ANAS aims to relieve the suffering of those in crisis and to rekindle their hopes for a better future. We work extensively with local and international organizations, helping disadvantaged individuals and communities survive and thrive.
One of ANAS's core mission is to help empower young people, students in their academic and career journey. We do this in various stages. We help them in their onboarding program, we help mentor them, we help in terms of their internship and in their personal development as well as career development plans. All this we do because we believe in enhancing their potential, in giving them the best that they can achieve so they can contribute back to society. As a result of this, ANAS youth and those who've been mentored have come together to form AYC, ANAS Youth Collective, where they combine their experiences and bring together best practices so that other young people can benefit in their journey, in their professional, in their academic, and in their personal development.
Saya berterima kasih kepada ANAS kerana menjadi sebuah platform untuk kaum belia seperti saya untuk mengenali antara satu sama lain.
In English or in Mandarin? 来到了 ANAS， 我学到了很多东西。我学我自己的阿拉伯家世，我也学到了阿拉伯的传统。我学到了这种东西，我有好像一个骄傲的感觉，因为在 ANAS 我自己也学自己。
طبيعتنا الاستشارية هي الجانب الخاص من أنس. كل شخص لديه فرصة لتقديم اقتراحاتنا في تخطيط البرامج، وهذا يسمح لنا بالاستفادة من خبرات وإبداع جميع الأعضاء سواء كانوا من الكبار أو الشباب.
So previously, every time I go to the drink stall auntie, I will ask for a teh siew dai. Auntie, 我要一个 teh siew dai, 可以包吗? And then she'll always be shocked, how come I speak in Mandarin? And then she will say like, hey, 你是什么种族? What's your race? At that point, I don't really know what to answer.
Walaupun Anas ditubuhkan oleh kaum Arab peranakan, saya rasa bangga kerana program-program kita tidak terhad kepada masyarakat kami sahaja, tetapi juga dapat memberi kesan kepada masyarakat-masyarakat lain.
After coming to Anas and learning about Arabic tradition and culture and my own lineage and history, now I go to the drink store auntie and when she asks me the same question, 我说我是阿拉伯人, I'm an Arab.
Anas welcomes partners and supporters from all walks of life. Come join us. Come support Anas.
We
are all connected.
Wow, Muhammad, I never knew you could speak Mandarin.
Neither did I. Okay, so now on to the main event. Today we will be discussing and launching a very important book titled Arab Worlds Beyond the Middle East and North Africa, and it celebrates the achievements and acknowledges the challenges of the new communities that Arabs have built around the world.
Today, we are joined by the very editors and contributors of the book appearing live via Zoom. And in addition, we have two panelists here with us today who will be discussing some of the ideas touched by the book. We would like to give a quick introduction to each of them. Our first panelist is Dr. Mariam Alkazemi, and she is joining us from Richmond, Virginia. In addition to being one of the two editors of the book, she is currently an assistant professor at the Robertson School of Media and Culture and has served as a Carnegie Fellow at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She has also authored over 25 peer-reviewed publications on topics that range from honor-based violence to political cartoons in the Arab world, and her first co-authored book on Kuwaiti media law was published in 2018. Dr. Alkazemi has also served as an officer of religion and media interest group, and in 2020 was the recipient of the Gurner Award by the International Studies Association.
Our second panelist is Dr. Claudia Youakim, and she is logging in from Richmond, Virginia as well. She is the co-editor of the book. She is also a sociologist who serves as the Deputy Director of Knowledge Management and Research at the Center for Inclusive Business and Leadership at the American University of Beirut. She is also an affiliate scholar at the Institute for the Study of International Migration in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Her research focuses on the intersection of Arab identity, migration patterns, and pushing for inclusive systems.
Our third panelist is Khodor Khalid, and he is joining us today from Cairo. He holds an MA from the American University in Cairo and is the founding director of the digital platform, The Digital Interpreter. He is also the founding member of the South American Arab Countries Institute.
Our fourth panelist is Aisha Al-Kharousi, and she is joining us from Muscat, Oman. She served as the Deputy Consul General of Oman to Singapore from 2011 to 2016 and was awarded the Nanyang Outstanding Young Alumni Award whilst pursuing her master's at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies for playing an instrumental role in establishing Oman's diplomatic mission in Singapore.
Now, we would like to invite our two discussants who are with us today up on stage, Dr. James Sidaway and Dr. Farid Alatas. Dr. James Sidaway is a professor of political geography at NUS, and he previously worked at the University of Amsterdam and several universities in England, including in his hometown of Birmingham. His key research concerns the intersections of cities and geopolitics and history and philosophy of human geography.
Dr. Farid Alatas, who will be our moderator for today's session, is a professor of sociology at the National University of Singapore. His research interests include historical sociology, the sociology of social science, the sociology of religion, and interreligious dialogue. Maybe invite a warm round of applause to invite all of our panelists and speakers today as well. Without further ado, we would like to hand over the session to our moderator, Dr. Farid.
I've forgotten how to do these things, because this is the first time in 2 years, I think, that we're actually physically in a, in an academic function. So I'm Mr. Said, Mohamed Alhabshi, Mr. George Yeo, and guests. Welcome to this book launch. I'm very happy to have been asked to moderate this. Just a few words before we actually begin with the remarks by the book editors and our discussant, Professor James Sidaway. It's very rare that the Arabs have migrated all over the world. And in Singapore, Singaporeans know very well that there is a small community of Arabs who come from the Hadramaut, which is today in the state of, part of the state of the Republic of Yemen. But as I think Mr. Yeo pointed out, very few people know, especially from this part of the world, that there's a sizable Arab community in North America, in South America. And many names that we know of, many names we have heard of, many politicians, writers, people in the arts, actors, whose names we have heard of, whom we have possibly seen on TV, in the movies, we don't realize that they're of Arab origin. Mr. Yeo mentioned Danny Thomas, because Mr. Yeo is from a different generation. He may have seen Danny Thomas on TV. I also remember seeing Danny Thomas on TV, but Mr. Yeo didn't mention Danny Thomas' daughter, Marlo Thomas, who was also an actress. Now, but what is interesting is that there are very few studies that bring together Arab immigration or the Arab diaspora in Southeast Asia with the Arab diaspora elsewhere, especially in North and South America. This book is one of the first. It's not exactly the first, because I remember in Kyoto about 20 years ago at a conference that I attended, organized by a Japanese Middle East Studies Association. The conference had brought together scholars who were working on Middle Eastern diasporas to different parts of the world, including Iranians in Japan, Arabs in North America, and of course Hadramis in Southeast Asia. But there are very, very few conferences and research projects and works that actually bring the studies of the Arab diaspora in different parts of the world together. So this book is very important in that respect. Just a few words also about the Arabs. We know about Arabs, and we can recognize things Arabic when we come across them, but who exactly are the Arabs, right? Now, most of the Arab genealogists of the past, centuries ago, divide the Arabs into three types. You have what they call the Al-Arab al-Ba'ida, the distant Arabs, distant in terms of time, right? They are actually the extinct Arabs, the very original Arabs who no longer exist, and they're associated, they refer, for example, to the communities or tribes of the Ad and Thamud which are mentioned in the Quran, and other groups as well, which no longer exist. So these are called the extinct Arabs. And then the second group are the what is called the pure Arabs, and this refers to the southern Arabs, the Arabs from Yemen, who are said to be descendants of one ancestor called Gahtan. So they are the Gahtani Arabs. And many of the Yemenis and people from the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula are descendants from Gahtan. And then you have the Arabized Arabs, or also known as the Adnani Arabs. And they are said to be descendant of Adnan, who is himself a descendant of the Prophet Abraham from his son Ismail. Now they are Arabized because Al-Arab al-Musta'ariba, they're called Arabized because their ancestors were not originally Arabic speaking. You know, they were, Ismail originally spoke Aramaic, but he's said to have married a Yemeni, and then their descendants became Arabic speakers. So they are called Arabized Arab. But of course, over the centuries, the Adnani and Gahtani Arabs became, intermarried, and so you can't really, there are no pure lineages. And then, after the rise of Islam, the spread of Islam, and together with the spread of Islam, or rather, the spread of Arab groups, communities, tribes from the Arabian Peninsula, and with them, the spread of Islam to Egypt, to Syria, to Iraq, to other parts of what we call the Middle East, and to North Africa, you have the Arabization of communities that were not Arab before, like Egyptians, for example, or like Syrians, Palestinians, Lebanese, and so on. So the Arabs have, are really a mix. They're not a race. They are really a mix of various communities, various linguistic groups, and they have spread throughout the world, as this book will show. So just to end this, very, very brief introduction, you could say that, the spread of Arabs is something like the spread of coffee. When coffee spreads, something happens to it. And this is not unrelated to Arabs, because indeed the Arabs were responsible for the spread of coffee, specifically the Yemenis, more specifically the Hadramis, and even more specifically my ancestors on my grandmother's side. My father's mother was from the Al-Aidrus family, originally from Hadramaut, and the Al-Aidrus family, some of the Sufis among them were responsible for the spread of coffee in the 16th century among Sufi circles, because the Sufis found that drinking coffee would allow you to be alert, to stay awake at night, to be alert, so that you can engage in the ritual, readings and practices of the Sufis. And of course, they were not the only people. There were also other sheikhs, other scholars, other groups that spread the use of coffee. So from Yemen, it went to Iran, to Turkey, during the Ottoman period, and from there it made its way to Europe. The Europeans in the beginning were not happy with coffee because of the effects it had, on the mind. So the Pope had issued a fatwa, if you will, saying that this is the drink of the infidels and it should be banned. And in fact, the Muslims themselves initially had said that coffee is not to be tolerated. It's it should be prohibited. But because the beneficial effects were realized, both the Christians in Europe and the Muslims began to see it as halal. But coffee, as it spread, took on different, various preparations of coffee developed in the areas that it had spread to. So you have the coffee of the, Qahwa Arabiya, Arabic coffee prepared by the by the Gulf Arabs, which is different from the form that it took in the Levant, in the areas ruled by the Ottomans. In some preparations it is black, in some preparations it is more golden in color, in some preparations it is laced with saffron, in some preparations it is cooked with or brewed with cardamom. And of course among the Hadramis it is prepared with ginger, gahwa bizanjabil we call it. And the same thing happened with the Arabs, right? When, with Hadramis, for example, when they went to Africa, they intermarried with Africans, with Kenyans, with Tanzanians. In our part of the world, with Malays, with Javanese, with Sundanese, and different Peranakan cultures developed among the Arabs, whether in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and the same thing goes for Latin America. Just like coffee. So this book is a wonderful book in the sense that it tells us something about this variety of cultures that developed among the Arabs, which is various, which is diverse, but at the same time there is a sense of a common identity. So this is what we wish to learn about from this book, and we hope to hear something about this from the various presentations. So I would now like to invite Dr. Mariam Alkazemi to make a presentation. Each of our panelists will spend from 5 to 10 minutes to talk about their work, and then my friend and colleague James will say a few words, and then we'll open up for a question and answer session. Dr. Mariam.
I want to begin by expressing what an honor it is to be in the presence of such distinguished guests. It's not every day that an academic can talk to government officials and have bankers in the audience. So it's a very big pleasure, and it also speaks to the importance with which this event is being treated. Speaks to the kind of respect towards the Singaporean Arab community, as well as the relationship between Singapore and Arab states and Arab communities around the world. And I want to begin by talking about how Arab diaspora communities, or diaspora communities in general, can really be seen or serve as a cultural bridge between different world regions. And it's an honor for me to speak here today to present Arab worlds beyond the Middle East, North Africa with Claudia, Aisha, and Khadr. And I want to begin. So I have basically, I want to begin by saying thank you to a few people, and then I would like to discuss 5 points that can be seen as motivating factors for this edited volume. So to begin with, I want to say thank you to the guest of honor, Mohamed Alhabshi, and guest speaker, George Yeo. It's really an honor to be in your presence, and it was very heartwarming to also hear the story about the Arab Christians and Muslims and how it's different in Singapore. To the sponsors, thank you very much for your support. I'd like to express my appreciation for the organizers and the members of the Arab Network at Singapore. There's a number of volunteers and members of the staff that have made this event possible. So thank you to Said Farid, Afrah, Huda, a number of individuals who helped with this. I'd also like to say thank you to Aisha. Aisha is a public figure, it seems, in Singapore, and there's also another story between Aisha and I, even different than our personal friendship. In her master's thesis, if you open up Aisha's master's thesis, which she did at a Singaporean university, you'll find my name. And you'll see that she said that I helped widen her perspective. And today, I'm here to say that she has done the same for me, and that I'm currently speaking from the United States, where the political rhetoric is about people agreeing with one another and kind of getting along in that way. But I'm proud of our differences. And because of our differences, we both benefit personally and otherwise. And this book is a direct reflection of that, and so is today's event. So I want to begin with that. To James Sidaway, thank you very much for being here, for your willingness to discuss the book. To all of our authors, you've made this possible. And to Claudia, thank you for your commitment to this experience and your willingness to take a little bit of a risk in putting this together. So with that, I'd like to begin by maybe introducing myself briefly, and then also talking about the motivations for this. And if we have time afterwards, there'll be a few other points to make. So to begin with, I'm a communications scholar, and I focus on international communication. And Claudia studies race relations, and she'll speak for herself. But one of the things that I think is really important to talk about is how important it is to generate knowledge about groups of people that then will cover in the media, right? So that's a starting point that I think is very important to focus on, that reporters and other individuals and media professionals will only report on what's available. So there's a responsibility here for scholars to be doing some amount of work. And so when Claudia and I first conceived of this book, like many other studies, it was very informal. And we talked about the differences between our personal observations as we went through life, as being Arab in different parts of the world, and also the fact that the literature did not reflect our realities. So as we got to know one another, learn about our personal histories, our backgrounds, our interest in travel, in studying groups of people, we noticed that there was just a real opportunity to make a contribution. This book is also motivated by the need to understand in a holistic way how diverse Arab communities are. So the word diaspora comes from the word dispersion, and so this goes back to the coffee idea. It's a really cool thing to look at all the different world regions, and we're missing, frankly, this book is not exhaustive by any means. We're missing many different groups of Arabs in many different countries in the world that would really be an advantage to include. Particularly, we had some challenges finding anthropologists willing to write a chapter on Arab communities on both the east and west coast of Africa. So we think about this as a good beginning, this project that we're working on. Further, we're strengthened by having the number of different perspectives in this book. And when I mean strengthened, I mean that we have both historians, political scientists, we have communication scholars, we have many different perspectives from different disciplines within the academic realm in this book. And they study society at different levels, the cultural level, the national level, the individual level. And so you will see that the book provides a nuanced analysis because of the engagement with different groups of people and analysis at different levels, right? Finally, one of the things that I think this book is also motivated by is, it's been nothing other than a pleasure to get to talk to people who serve in government and realize that we need to do a better job. And this speaks to some of my interactions with Aisha. We need to do a better job of bridging the gap between the academic world and the non-academic world. okay? And so we're very, very proud of a couple of things. Number one, we've had 2 career diplomats as contributing authors in this text. And also, the cover of the book is a piece of art by a distinguished artist who's a member of the Arab diaspora, and I think Claudia may speak to this a little bit more. So these are some of the motivations and maybe some of the takeaways, if you will. I'd like to maybe make a few points about the book overall. The book really shows that the Arab diaspora is not a singular community, that there are communities in places like Argentina and Singapore, that in some places the community is still strong and alive, but in places like Cuba, the community does not have a big presence anymore. It talks about some of the struggles of losing touch of one's roots and also celebrating our identity, remembering Arab musicians prior to the Great Depression. We have different groups of Arabs. In this book, we have Arabs from the Levant. Four chapters are dedicated to Latin America. We have people who are refugees, forcibly migrated. We have examples of North Africans in France, Hadramis in Singapore. And so you'll notice that we tried to pay particular attention to some nuances that, nuances and subtleties that I think are worthy of consideration. And I will end on a note that we have to remember that even today in 2021, as we speak, there are people who have had to leave the MENA region, sometimes in unfortunate circumstances at a young age. And some of these people will be turning to libraries and cultural venues to try to understand their life stories and the circumstances in which they existed. And it is, my hope that this book will offer a sense of solidarity for anybody who wants to learn, as well as the understanding that knowledge can be empowering. We can learn from the decisions of others, and for all others who are interested in culture in general, I hope that this book really speaks to you. So thank you very much, and I will mute myself.
Thank you very much, Mariam. We look forward to more discussion later. But for now, I'd like to invite Dr. Claudia Youakim to say a few words.
Thank you for that, Mariam, and thank you everyone for your attendance. Thank you to the Arab Network Singapore, NS, for organizing this wonderful event, and Aisha for making this connection and your contribution, which is valued, and all of the other authors and everyone for organizing the event as well. We're grateful to have this book featured in this time of celebration, and we're grateful that we are able to highlight the Arab diaspora in Singapore alongside the collection of chapters that illustrate the various trajectories from the MENA region to other nations. I didn't realize that this was one of the first times that the Arab diaspora in Singapore was featured along other diasporic communities. I was a bit surprised about that, just because we live in such a globalized society, and I feel like we're so connected in so many ways, and it was just kind of surprising for me to hear this. So I'm happy about that, and it sits along the side of the chapters that include Palestinians in Chile, Syrians in Argentina, as well as Syrian refugees in the US, Lebanese in Brazil, Maghrebis in France, Arabs in Cuba, the US, Canada, and there really was not enough room in one book to capture the communities of Arabs all over the world. Trying to include as many trajectories as possible from the MENA to various parts of the world was very difficult. We were aiming to point to the diversity of the MENA region and at the same time to capture the variations in the movement. But we do realize that when we say something like Arab diaspora, or when we say MENA region, that we're referring to a specific Arab country, that these are, they're dynamic people and places with diverse groups and patterns of behavior. And so it's quite difficult to go in as much depth and include as many trajectories as possible. It definitely, we hope that this inspires people to kind of continue in this direction. Even with, one country, there are multiple immigration patterns that are heavily dependent on social, economic, and political reasons that induce patterns of migration. And so we just want to kind of honor that and, be very clear about this not being exhaustive, but we hope it's a great start to, or a continuation more so of these kind of conversations. So for the book, we didn't want to limit our authors in terms of their exploration, and we really didn't know. We didn't want to set a limit to what years of immigration or what generations to investigate. So you'll see with some chapters, authors focus on children of immigrants, where other chapters it might be focusing on refugees or first-generation immigrant communities. And so we wanted the submissions to kind of given our broad vision of the Arab immigration from the MENA, we wanted to see what we would get in our submissions. And we were pleasantly surprised to receive a good number of chapters. And because we left it to each author in the book to decide on the framework of immigration and settlement, some chapters focus more on social, and some chapters focus more on historical aspects, others more on contemporary scenarios of Arab communities. So there is a wide variety. This work is not only important, it's timely and necessary to break the monolith, as Mariam had mentioned. Representation is very important. Mariam and I would often, we both went to the University of Florida, and we'd often, and this kind of is how this book emerged, through our conversations of being frustrated, seeing that the knowledge and literature was limited. We didn't feel that we were represented as much, like in a global kind of world. I knew that Arabs existed elsewhere. I have family ties to Santiago, Chile. My dad had lived there before the US. I can never really find literature to cover that. And so it was nice to kind of have that in a book like this. I feel that, it's fairly well represented. And, I hope that, we're grateful for each contributor, and we hope that this book does inspire more work on international migration patterns, transnational and pan-ethnic identities, and expanding on the idea and meaning of home. And I think this is an important component to mention, the complexity and the messiness of how do we define home? What does that mean? I think it's, I think for anyone that's an immigrant or a child of immigrants or, a migrant, it becomes, the trajectory is a little bit blurred. And, it's a complicated subject when, you have groups of people that immigrate from one nation to another. So immigrant communities have to reimagine and recreate what home is, which in large part is driven by having a familiar community, an ethnic and linguistic familiarity, having a sense of national belonging, etc. And so all of this is in question through the immigration process. In this book, we see that home is defined and redefined through personal, political, and social constructs that are rooted in ancestral ties to the MENA region, but it also combines one's new life and surroundings, which kind of almost emerges a new cultural dynamic, a new ethnic pan-ethnic identity that emerges. So when we think about Arab ancestry and identities, we see that it is most pronounced in immigrant communities, which are the first generation, followed by children of immigrants, who are the second generation. But we see that with each generation, these ethnic markers, such as someone's accent, their wardrobe, their cultural adaptation, it becomes a bit more ambiguous. So over time, holding on to one's culture and identity, like speaking the language of parents or grandparents, it becomes a little bit more difficult from one generation to another. And this happens as the generations immerse more and more into their host society or new nation state. What we also see, though, is that groups who have ties to their ancestral homeland, be it, if they have family abroad or they have these pull factors that are kind of, they're not restricted in their movement, these kind of things help sustain the ethnic and cultural ties. They're more likely to be maintained in those kind of scenarios. It is important to mention also that these ties could also be maintained within an ethnic enclave where there's an influx of immigrants, as well through organizational community ties. So, if there's an intention to do that. So like the Arab network at Singapore has demonstrated for the past decade. So, thank you, Anas, for all that you do to honor Arab identity and preserving the cultural and historical ethnic community ties and providing the space, a supportive community, and doing educational and humanitarian work, et cetera, et cetera. So I just, I kind of want to bring it back to the importance of having this space and this, what it is, how this book ties to the space is that, we are able to kind of preserve and sustain those ties because of organizations like NS. That's all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I hope we can return to some of these issues later, and also with regard to preservation. One of the common points has to do with music, and as you saw in our presentation earlier on, we had Taqsim. The South Arabian or Hadhrami music continues in this part of the world, in the Malay world, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. Some of the genres or some of the forms that we practice here are no longer practiced in the Hadramaut itself. And I noticed that there's a chapter on music in your book. So perhaps we can do something together on music and other arts in the diaspora. Yes. Thank you, Claudia.
Great.
We'll pick this up later. And now I would like to invite Mr. Khodor Khalid to make his presentation.
Hello, good morning to everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers, the National University of Singapore, ANAS. Thank you to the audience that is actually present there and the audience that is online. Thank you to my colleagues, Claudia and Mariam, for putting this book together. To my co-author, Aisha. I'm very touched by this moment. I'm from Argentina. I grew up in a very small town, agricultural town in the middle of the Pampas. I'm a fourth generation Arab, but as any Argentine, I am mixed. But obviously the Arabic genes took over. As you can tell, I have no Italian heritage. I didn't get any of that. Even my name is an Arabic name. So I feel somewhat that I have been on a journey throughout my whole life. And particularly after 2001, ever since then, the war on terrorism, Arabs and Muslims, I felt, started being a little bit discriminated and persecuted, and being, in a sense, the victim of security policies. I lived in the US before and after 2001, and I noticed the changes in social perceptions. So my chapter, which is about Argentina's immigration policy as a response to the Syrian refugee crisis, touches a little bit on this issue and contributes to what I think is my mission, at least in the past, in the last decade, which is to retrieve and revalue the contribution of Arabs and Muslims, particularly in my case, in Argentina and South America. So in my chapter, what I do basically is I tell a little bit about the story of Arab migration from the Levant to Argentina. For those who are not familiar, Argentina has about a population of about 40 million people. And today, about 10% of that population has Arab ascendancy, mostly Syrian and Lebanese, but there is also a small Palestinian community. And this diaspora, this Arab diaspora in Argentina, has actually contributed to society at large in different activities and professions. You know, we have famous football players with Arab ascendancy. We had presidents, members of the different activities, be it music, politics, sports. You can always find someone with an Arabic name, and this is, I think, is fascinating. However, it was not the largest immigration community. It was about the third or fourth, depending on the numbers. We don't have really good records about this, just because they were registered under different categories. But the point is, the Arab immigration to Argentina was quite important, and it had an impact. And the reason why I highlight this, and as Professor Alatas was telling me, it's like we usually don't hear about this, and you know how Arabs went to South America. So that is the reason why I wanted to highlight this. The second part of my chapter deals a little bit with how the media actually cover the Syrian conflict and some of the shortcomings in that coverage to provide people, and not society at large, but also members of government, with the right information to be able to come up with policies that are actually effective and that you can actually implement in a way that has the impact that you're looking for. In this case, to receive Syrian immigrants and actually integrate them into society and offer them the tools to restart their life, in a sense, because, and they say restart, because those people who has to migrate, like my great grandparents back in the early 1900s, you know, to integrate into Argentinian society, they abandoned Arabic as a language and they abandoned Islam as a religion. And I think this is a heavy price that you have to pay when you migrate and you have to relocate and integrate. So it is necessary to have good and effective policies that take into consideration the particularities of the situation from which refugees are coming from and going to. And the third part specifically is where I deal with what in Argentina we call the Syrian program, which is a policy that briefly, it gives Syrian refugees a humanitarian visa. This means that in the process, refugees actually lose their refugee status that is protected by international law, meaning that in the end of the day, they have less rights being secure and guaranteed. And this has a big impact, because if the international community is not going to bear the burdens of relocating populations around the world, this burden is going to fall, at least within the framework of the Syrian program in Argentina. That burden is going to fall in the society. Society itself will have to and had to provide for housing, education, health for all the Syrian immigrants, the recent ones, particularly starting in 2014, that relocated to Argentina. And my main point of argument here in the chapter is that Argentina had a break while implementing this policy. And that break has to do with a change in government and how what started as a humanitarian policy for family reunification, and this is one important, I'll open a small parenthesis here. I talk about family reunification because it was the Arab diaspora, and particularly the Syrian Arab diaspora in Argentina, who pushed and demanded a response from the Argentine government to the Syrian refugee crisis, because many of them wanted to get their family to a safe place and bring their cousins, uncles, aunts, out of Syria and to Argentina to offer them shelter. So the change started by the end of 2015 when we have a new government, and what started as a family reunification policy ended up being used as leverage for the new Argentinian government to present themselves to the world. And the implication or the consequence that this had within the Syrian program itself are basically two that I would like to highlight at this moment. One had to do with the growing security checks. And this I was able to see because I was part of the Syrian committee who was actually mediating between refugees and the government. So as we are sitting at the Syrian committee at the National Directorate for Migration, we had, for example, members of the intelligence service pretending to be representatives of the Syrian community. And their input was always referred to what if, some of these refugees that are being benefited by the Syrian program end up being terrorists. And this was always a concern being raised. And the second point that I want to raise is that when this change in government happened and the policy transformed from a family reunification program into a leverage for foreign policy, the Arab diaspora as a contributor to the policy was displaced. Basically, the Syrian committee was taken apart briefly after the change in government, and the institutions that were actually the first ones to demand for a response to the immigration to the Syrian refugee crisis were from the policymaking process. Now, if there were no Arab diaspora in Argentina, I have big doubts that Argentina would have come up and implemented a Syrian policy at all, because at the end of the day, it was the Syrian diaspora and the Arab diaspora at large, the one who demanded from the Argentinian government a response to the Syrian refugee crisis. So that being said, that is briefly what I discuss in my chapter, and I want to thank again the university. I want to thank Anas. I want to thank my colleagues, co-authors. To be honest, I'm very humble of having been invited here today and be able to speak to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hodor. fascinating. Many interesting points that you made, but something you mentioned about the heavy price of migration, losing religion, for example, losing Islam, you mentioned. In our case, in the case of the Hadramis, we did not lose the religion. In fact, we were carriers of a particular Sufi order, the Ba'alawi order, which our ancestors brought to East Africa, to the southern part of India and to the Malay world. But we did lose other things, language being one of them. So I think the price of migration is something that we should also talk about and remember. So we'll hopefully, once again come back to these issues during the discussion. And we now turn to our final author in the volume. Before we listen to the discussion by Professor Sidaway. So we have Aisha Al-Kharousi, who was with us in Singapore for a few years, and with whom we had much cooperation and also friendship. But also important to note that while we talk about diasporas, we've been referring to the Arab diaspora in the Americas. We talked about Hadhrami diaspora, but Aisha comes from Oman, and Oman has its own diaspora, very important diaspora. Maybe the only diaspora that had a kingdom, I think, in Zanzibar, yes? Of course, the Omanis didn't go quite as far as the Hadramis. Omanis didn't come as far as Southeast Asia, but they were very important, formed very important communities in India and Africa, especially in East Africa. But Aisha did not write about the Omanis, she wrote about Hadramis, and we're very happy for that. Please, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Professor Farid. Mashallah, I'm very humbled by the amount of gratitude. I feel it's disproportionate that I'm receiving for this event coming about. Thank you all very much. It's wonderful to be back in Singapore, engaging with Singapore. Unfortunately, it's virtually this time after so many years away. I'm really very thrilled to be here joining you all today. Honorable First Gentleman, Excellencies, esteemed guests, colleagues, friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allow me first to begin by congratulating the Arab Network at Singapore. This is truly a milestone occasion. Dedication, or a decade of dedication, is an apt moniker. So mabruk to everyone at ANAS for 10 years of service. This has been quite a refreshing project for me. It was a wonderful exercise personally to chronicle the deep and enduring friendships I fostered during my tour on the island. And this is just a small way of doing that. My interest, fascination really with the Arab influence in Singapore started with the Jewel of Muscat project. The Dhow, 9th century Dhow that sits so majestically today at the Sentosa, Resorts World Sentosa. That we have Mr. George Yeo here. I think everyone in the audience should really take advantage of that and pick his brain about how that project came about. It's quite a unique initiative. But it was really Oman's participation with the Urban Redevelopment Authority in 2012 to renovate Muscat Street in the Kampong Glam area in the Arab quarter of Singapore. That really hit home for me how influential the Arab influence is in the DNA of Singapore, really. And not only from the 1800s, but very much today as well. We found almost everything we needed to create an Arab atmosphere around the event, largely due to ANAS's help. And that stretch of Muscat Street in the historic Kampong Glam, right next to Sultan Mosque, really says all you need to know about Oman's connection, not only as Professor Farid said, we didn't get as far as the Hadramis, but we did make it to Singapore in a small way, and Muscat Street is a testimony to that. The preparatory work we did, exploring the National Archives and working closely with the Foreign Ministry and URA, cemented for me the depth and breadth of the Arab influence. It was not only restricted to trade and religion, but it was involved with the establishment of madrasas, so they were involved in the education realm, in the municipal realm, as well as the cultural and even the health sectors. And I discuss that briefly in the book. But before I go further there, I just want to say that I'm very grateful to Dr. Mariam Alkazemi for reaching out and inviting me to participate. I think, yes, everyone is surprised why I'm not talking about the Omanis in East Africa. We initially discussed doing that, but it didn't come to pass. However, we are old friends and colleagues at the George Washington University. So she indulged me when I requested that I contribute a chapter on the Hadramis in Singapore. And just to digress a bit, my minor in college was cultural anthropology. So if I wasn't engaged professionally with the Foreign Ministry, I think I'll be cooped up in some library, investigating and researching foreign civilizations. So I'm very grateful to Mariam for giving me a glimpse into what my alternative life might have been if it had not gone down the diplomatic path. And let me tell you, diplomacy in the Middle East seems like a walk in the park next to the professional academic life. These few months putting the chapter together really made me feel that. I was lucky to have unique access as a foreigner into the active, thriving community that is the Hadhrami Singaporean community. I attended weddings, births, funerals. It was extraordinary really to feel the link that these Singaporeans, and very proud Singaporeans, had to their homeland, even though they didn't speak the language in many cases. Some of them had never even visited Yemen, let alone Hadramaut. But I chose to focus on the historical element of the diaspora in keeping with the larger objective of the project. As a whole, I thought that would be best. Before I highlight some elements of the chapter, I want to extend special thanks to Professor Farid Al-Attas. His passion for the topic from a sociology perspective was infectious. I think we got a glimpse of that today in his introduction to the panel. You feel like when you're sitting with him that you're getting a master's course on Arab history, not only in Singapore and the archipelago, but in general. So whether it was at dinners at his house or at INAS events, I was always thrilled to sit and learn more about this fascinating history. And I used his thesis on kin as a basis for my own research. It was a nodal point around which the rest of the arguments were made. And I implored him to co-author the chapter with me, but unsurprisingly, he was committed to other projects. I haven't forgiven him yet, but it's okay. This event perhaps compensates for that. It was very interesting and educational for me to explore the arguments I had heard him make over the years from my own academic lens. When you pick up the book and read the chapter, I hope you identify with the truly extensive impact of the contributions of the Arabs, particularly the Arab pioneers, an impact that continues to be felt today, and be reminded of the need to embrace the values of tolerance and encourage not only integration, but assimilation. So many places in the world today need those values championed, just as Khador was expressing so beautifully now. We need this idea of embracing the other to be celebrated and not viewed as a threat. For those unfamiliar with the history of the Arab community in the archipelago, when you read the chapter, you will discover the first known Arabs in Singapore were immigrants twice over. They were wealthy traders and merchants who came from Palembang, Indonesia, as Mr. Yeo touched on, and Professor Farid as well. And this was in 1819, when Singapore became a trading post. The fortunes of the community grew with Singapore's development. The Arabs were successful entrepreneurs involved in retail, wholesale, production, real estate, and much more. They were also actively involved in civic, charitable, and social welfare causes. This culture of philanthropy was not an afterthought, but took root quite early on in Singapore's development. Their contributions served not just the Arab and Muslim communities, but also the wider Singapore community. Sayyid Ali Al Junaid donated funds toward the construction of Tan Tock Seng Hospital when it moved to the new site in 1850s. It was the first hospital in Singapore completely funded by the people. Many Singaporeans of Arab descent have made significant contributions in more recent times. I couldn't mention all of them in the book, but if you will allow me today, I just want to highlight a few here. I think Claudia and Mariam, you cut out all of those pages and pages that I had about all the examples of Arab contributions. So I'll just take this opportunity to mention one or two. The first minister in charge of Muslim affairs, Dr. Ahmed Matar, steered the development of Singapore in his capacity also as the Minister for Environment from 1985 to 1995. He was very active in the cleanup of the Singapore River, which we spent a lot of time on while I was there. Sayyid Yusuf Al-Saghaf, his long-standing and outstanding work on heritage orchids contributed to the successful inscription of the Singapore Botanic Gardens as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2015. He sat on the first National Parks Board and was instrumental in developing the National Orchid Garden. I had visited the Orchid Garden many times. Every friend or delegation who visited Singapore had that as a must-see or must-visit on their list, rightly so. But it was only on my 5th or 6th visit that I found out the history of Sayyid Yusuf's instrumental role, and that repeated for me. A lot of the times when we would go on, we would accompany delegations to official sites, I would just hear snippets of, there's an Arab contribution, but then, we'd move on. So I'm very glad that I was able to somewhat highlight that in the small chapter in this book. Habib Hassan Al-Attas, the Imam of Ba'alawi Mosque, he's a very strong advocate of interfaith harmony, and he serves currently as a council member of the Interreligious Organization, or IRO. Not one Hari Raya occasion passed without him opening his door to us. The mosque, it was so vibrant, you would forget altogether that you're celebrating Eid in Southeast Asia. So when we appreciate the nature of these cultural and community activities and lived realities, which are tangible and thriving today, it's not such a leap to look back in one's mind's eye 200 years ago and comprehend how the Hadrami's trading networks, those Arab pioneers, really did help establish Singapore as a thriving entrepot. Contributions of the Arabs in Singapore since the beginning have clearly enriched the archipelago's collective culture in many ways. Many of them adopted elements of Malay Indonesian culture because of intermarriage and familiarity with local customs. I discuss this from an identity politics perspective and explore how policies and laws such as continuously evolving CIMO model of the census taking and other targeted national policies forced a melding of the Hadhrami with the Malay particularly in the social fabric of the island, and a conflation really between the different but similar ethnic groups, the Arabs and the Malays, due to their joint Islamic faith. I hope my chapter provides an opportunity to learn more about them and help in the documentation and research for prosperity, and more importantly, open the door for further study. Today, ANAS is continuing this strong tradition of giving back to the community. The video we just saw bears witness to the long history and significant contributions that we discuss, intercultural understanding and embracing the values of openness and inclusion over the years. and keeping the identity alive among the youth in Singapore, which is great to see. We have them as MCs, you know, they were behind the scenes when we were preparing for this event. So I'm very happy to see that. And it's really an applaudable initiative and effort by Anas. I remain inspired by how these courageous Hadhrami immigrants braved the unknown to come to Singapore and thrived against all odds to make a living here. I would like to echo what Mr. Yeo said in his remarks. The task of building trust and a shared identity between religiously and culturally diverse communities must continue and must be a collective effort by everyone. For Singapore is a shining example to the rest of the world. You make it look easy, but it takes, the editors, as we've already heard, have chosen a wide range of countries in an unprecedented compilation. I'm proud to be part of this project and hope it rallies all communities to take action to foster social cohesion and interfaith harmony. May it inspire all of us to reflect on the past and how these stories have woven into the rich tapestry of the societies beyond the Middle East and North Africa that Arabs have taken as their home. To conclude, simply, it is my privilege to be a part of the launch of this book. My only regret is I could not be there with all of you today. There are too many people I would like to recognize, but allow me to take this opportunity to thank all of you, distinguished members of this Hadhrami community. It was a profound honor and a genuine pleasure to put my brief but rich experience on record in this editorial way. Khadija Al-Attas, Anas's inspiring president, she was my honorary aunt practically throughout my tour on the island. She continues to hold that title. I think she checks in just as regularly as my other aunts to see, you know, am I married? What's the marital status? Just as an update, not yet. I haven't managed to lock anyone down, but she really opened her home for myself, my family. She even accompanied my mother when she was on the island seeking treatment at SGH in 2014. I was busy with a delegation and she just said, you know, relax, I got it. And she would take my mother to her hospital appointments and she would follow up. So I'm ever grateful for that. And I really feel blessed to call her a friend. And really this event today, she keeps putting it on me, but this event really would not have been possible without her tireless efforts and persistence. My thanks extend to the whole Anas team, but particularly Huda Al-Junaid. She was the captain of all of us for providing reference material from her archives, from the National Archives, and anecdotes from their family, all the Anas members, from their family members, from their network over the months I worked on the chapter. And finally, Mr. Alawi Aidid from the Arab Association, Al-Wahda, for putting me in touch with Talib Amin, who I quote extensively in the work, and his kindness and hospitality throughout my time in Singapore. So thank you sincerely and congratulations to everyone involved in this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aisha, for that. Since you brought up the issue of hospitality, I should also mention that Aisha has been very hospitable to us, to me. I had one of my trips to, I think it was to Iran or Turkey. I stopped in, transited in Muscat and for a few hours, and you know, she took me. She and her father received me at the airport, took me to their home, and treated me to a very lovely lunch, and you know, we had a wonderful conversation as well. So anyway, the point is, we are all, you know,
some Yemeni honey as well.
Yes, that's right. We've got some honey and dates. Well, the point is, we are all very hospitable people, if I may do some boasting. And also Oman is very special to us, to Hadramis, partly because the western part of Oman has a border with the eastern part of Hadramaut, and in history, there is a part of Oman, which borders Hadhramaut in Yemen, which is considered to be actually part of Hadhramaut. And it is referred to by the geographers and the historians as Greater Hadhramaut, Hadhramaut Kubra, which actually includes a part of Oman. And also the other thing is one of the ancestors of the Ba'alawi Sada has his grave in Oman and is known as the Sahib Marbat, the Lord of Marbat. So Oman is of course very special to us. So last but not least, we have Professor James Sidaway, who will say a few words about the book. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of time after that to have a short Q&A session. James.
Thank you. Farid, you asked me to be fairly brief because I would talk about coffee. And I think we'll leave coffee, perhaps we'll drink coffee instead of talk about it. I'll just say a few words on Muscat Street, though, before I comment on the book, since it cropped up. I always take visitors, academic visitors. I'm a professor of geography at NUS. So I always take visiting academics, especially geographers, and especially other Europeans and Americans, to take a look at the monument, because it contains a map. And it's a map which is centered on the Indian Ocean. And it's a map that extends to China, to Southeast Asia, and of course, Arabia. And it's a map that does not show Europe. Europe is on the margins of the map. It doesn't matter. The United States is on the margins of the map. It's a map that's centered on a history of trade and connection that actually long predates the Western-centered economy and world system. And in that way, it's a map that perhaps anticipates the future as well, in terms of where the center of the world system will be. You can see I'm a geographer, I'm talking about maps. But I'm asked here very briefly to comment on the book. So please, good morning to you all, good afternoon, assalamu alaikum. I will speak briefly. So, as a professor of geography, what do? Of course, we take people to see maps, yeah? And we map things. But we're interested in the relations between places, spaces, landscapes, and the world. And when academics, geographers, and many others, sociologists like my colleague Farid, and journalists and the media, and political figures started to talk about globalization back in the 1980s, and through the 1990s, everybody was talking about globalization. Actually, Singapore was first, to talk about globalization and global city, but that's another history, another story. There was sometimes an assumption that globalization was something new, or that it had happened in recent decades. Of course, it was a post-Cold War moment. The world was changing. It seemed like a new moment, so people emphasized the novelty. Boundaries, borders were coming down. The world was shrinking. The world was connecting. So there was a lot of stress on the novelty of globalization. And of course, financial flows had increased massively since the 1970s. World trade had increased since the 1960s, and the end of the Cold War, meant new senses of connection. But what are flows of people? Because the collection that Mariam and Claudia have edited is actually about long-standing historical flows, that predate this idea of globalization as something that came in the late 20th century. So these long-standing, as well as recent flows of Arab peoples beyond the Middle East and North Africa. I think what the book does very nicely is to, thank you, Farid, yeah. What the book does very nicely is to indicate a much longer historical process and imagination of connection, of flows, of globalization than those 1980s and 1990s ideas of globalization. So this is a story of people on the move across oceans and continents for centuries, and of communities that are conscious of those moves, conscious of those mobilities. So the history of mobility enters their minds, becomes part of their identity. And this is why, in studying these flows, the editors and the authors work with this idea of diaspora. Now, diaspora can be defined in different ways, and it has different forms. But their working definition identifies 4 features. Number 1, dispersal to a minimum of 2 locations, so a multi-sited geography. You know? Number 2, the relationship to a homeland, actual or imagined. So a relationship to the idea of a place of origin as a second point. Now, to say that it might be imagined, that that relationship is imagined, does not mean that it's untrue or insignificant. After all, it's been argued that nations are also a kind of imagined community. And we don't say that that makes them unreal or untrue. Instead, it's more useful to ask how and in what style are they imagined and with what consequences. So dispersal, imagined homeland, and third, a self-awareness of a diaspora group's identity, a sense of self-identity and difference. And fourth, the existence of a community for more than one generation. So a lineage, a notion of time as well as space, linked to all of the above. So a diaspora is more than just migrants. Diaspora mobilizes a historical and geographical imagination and a sense of community. And as the book points out, the diasporas are very diverse and complex and worthy of study. And to study them, to foreground diasporas, to focus on diasporas, is an alternative to histories and sociologies that put the nation state first. And of course, nation states matter, but they should not be our sole point of reference in understanding the world. And the book, I think, indicates this very nicely. And it's about the diversity of the Arab diaspora with these 10 chapters, as we've heard: Canada, Cuba, France, Germany, South America, Argentina, the United States. Time is short. It's impossible to summarize the chapters here. But I think, Aisha, because you're joining us, and I think for many in the audience today, the chapter that they will turn to first is your chapter, chapter 5, on the identity politics of the Hadhrami diaspora in Singapore. And it's a complex story, as we've already heard. You tell a complex story. And in my last 4 minutes here, because if we want to have a little time for Q&A, it's better that I stop. In my last 4 minutes, I'll just comment on three of your arguments, or key arguments and findings. Firstly, you point out that the Hadhrami diaspora is somewhat understudied. I think that has begun to change in recent years, actually, and the literature that your chapter reviews does signal that. The Hadhrami diaspora is on the map of diaspora studies worldwide. I think the second point that you make is of course, this large and continuing contribution of the diaspora to Singapore's progress, from early on sponsors of public buildings, mosques, infrastructure, public service, and the continuing roles in academy and government and Muslim community. And finally, third, I think the point that I take away from the chapter about the community, and today's event embodies that, is the openness of the community. Because although deeply conscious of lineage and identity, the Hadhrami diaspora here, as elsewhere, has a long history of interactions that are a key part of its character. And allow me to speak on a personal note, just to end. My encounter with the Hadhrami diaspora is academic. It's in the library, it's in the books, it's in your chapter, but it's not just academic. It's more than academic. For it includes a welcome and rich sense of community that I have experienced. As an English Muslim, my ancestral home is not Hadramat, greater or otherwise, yes, but Birmingham in England. And as an English Muslim, I regularly encounter the openness and hospitality of the community, especially at Jummah and afterwards at Balwi Mosque in Lewis Road. Really, if we had time, Farid, and we would talk about the excellent coffee and the excellent biryani after worship. But I think enough of food and coffee. I think the point is here that we have a diaspora that both is in place, engages with place, and welcomes the world. And in that, there is a lesson for us all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. I think the point about globalization that you made is very important. Centuries before we began to talk about globalization, I think in the latter part of the 20th century and until today, we often talk about globalization as if it were a modern phenomenon, but and associated with industrialization and technology. But many communities were very globalized long before the industrial period, and the Hadramis and other Arab diasporas are examples of that globalization. So we have a few minutes. We may receive questions or comments from our physical audience here, as well as people who are with us via Zoom. So please make yourselves known if you want to ask a question or make a comment. I think the MCs you will be checking on who's zooming in.
Thank you, Dr. Farid. So yeah, just as a reminder from our audience on Zoom, if you have a question for the panelists, do click the raise hand icon. And for everyone here, you can just simply raise your actual hand. Yeah, and we will pass the microphone to you. In the interest of time, do limit yourself to one question per person. Please introduce yourself before asking a question, and thank you.
We have a question from Dr. Ko Chun Hui. Please.
Hi. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Chun Hui. I'm a historian of the Ottoman Empire. I wanted to ask the editors which were some of the Arab diaspora communities you wanted to include but might not have been able to include in this volume. Thank you.
Maybe, Claudia, do you mind if I...
Recording in progress.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Question. I'd come across the work of some anthropologists in so one of the things that's been very interesting for me is to look at Hadhrami Arab communities and Frankly, there was communities in Malaysia that we had read about. There are communities in Tanzania, in Kenya, kind of as mentioned. But as we did more and more kind of digging around, we realized that Ivory Coast, Ghana, a lot of the Western African nations, I some of the names escape me, sorry, it's about midnight over here, but there's several nations on the west coast of Africa that have also had very vibrant Lebanese communities, for example, and I read about the interactions between the Lebanese and colonizers to this part of the world, and sometimes their relations went well and sometimes they didn't, and there's lots of literature on how intermarriages work in these different communities, how people assimilate, and so it was really fascinating. We were sad that we couldn't include these. The other part of the world that is completely kind of absent is Australia, New Zealand. We had initially, there was actually a submission that we were hoping to include Arab food recipes, and the spread of them became very difficult to keep people on track. So that one was one we had to kind of let go of. So there are lots more communities, honestly. I studied abroad in Japan 13, 14 years ago, something like that. It was a brief stint, but that was the first time that I'd ever met my uncle, who had lived there for more than 30 years and has kids who don't, who don't really speak Arabic. And it was just fascinating to see. It was fascinating to see just all the different places that we could have had represented in the book. The chapters that were submitted initially, we had chosen maybe 3 or 4 more than what actually appear in the book right now. And what we'd really tried to do when we got the submissions, we had more than, I think we definitely had more than 33, maybe 34, 35 submissions. We took all the different chapter submissions and we tried to be very systematic in figuring out which ones should we include or exclude. And so we looked at how many observations would be present, what is the perspective in terms of discipline and characteristics, kind of where's the location of this community. So it was, while we do wish that we kind of had that opportunity more, we were quite happy with the end result, simply because with the time we had and the submissions that we had, we realized that we had a good product overall, even though it was incomplete.
Thank you, Mariam. We have time for one more question or comment, either from you here or from the Zoom. Yes.
Hi, my name is Tang Li. I used to contribute to a Saudi paper called Arab News back in 2006. Now, I grew up in the UK as a Chinese fellow, overseas Chinese fellow. So I also wanted to know, do you see, like in the case of the China, what they did was they used the overseas Chinese to help gather investment. Do you see any of the Arab nations looking at the value of the diaspora and trying to encourage them to build trade with their respective nations?
So you're asking a really good question. We did not focus many of our chapters on trade. However, I think there's a part of your question that I can still speak to, and it's that there are some parts of, for example, the chapter on Brazil comes to my mind. There's the chapter on Brazil looks at politicians in different regions, different political parties, and shows that that there's actually a large number of Lebanese that are active in Brazilian politics. I think what you're asking is the other way around. What is the relationship like in the Arab world what is the perspective towards these communities around the world. We did not get to that actually, but Claudia has asked me to consider something like that in a future potential volume. At this point, everything is tentative. But in terms of business, I think that there are. I'm pretty sure I have read quite a few articles about how a lot of the Arab communities, particularly, okay, I don't want to tell you information that's incorrect, but I am 100% sure that there have been lots of Arab diaspora communities that have continued their relationship. So it's not like it's one migration outside the Arab world. It's a continued trade relationship where I mentioned in my last response to the last question, issues of marriage. There were some families that were even faulted by their new home societies, their new, host societies, I guess you would say. Their new societies said that these people reject us because they go home to find wives and husbands. They go back to the original villages or towns or cities that they're from. And a lot of times there were trade relationships that these marriages were related to. Also, in terms of investment, I can't tell you that, I'm aware, and I imagine that Aisha might be even more aware, that there are all kinds of investment opportunities between the Gulf and many other parts of the world. I'm myself from Kuwait, and that's why the Gulf comes to my mind. But I think that I think there might be more than one world region where that's the case, and just because my brain tends to erase information, I don't want to say any kind of location, give you faulty information this time, but I could share with you some information, like some citations to read if you wish. My email address is MF, M as in Mary, F as in Frank, Alkazemi at vcu.edu. I'd be more than happy to share whatever information I do have.
Thank you, Mariam. Mariam, Claudia, Aisha, Khodr, I am not satisfied because we're coming to an end. There's a lot more that we would like to discuss. And I want to suggest to you that we meet at another occasion. We organize something together, maybe a workshop or a conference where we can talk at length about coffee, about music, about food, about identity, about Arabic, about qasaid, about poetry. Let's do this, without the pomp and ceremony of official events where we have to end at a certain time. Yes. So let's continue the conversation. I hand over to our MCs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for that very fruitful discussion. Now we have come to the next segment of today's event, the book launch. We would like to ask all the panelists to stay on, and we would like to invite our guest of honor, Mr. Mohamed Alhabshi, and guest speaker, Mr. George Yeo, accompanied by Madam Khadija, to join us in the official launch of the book.
Before we do continue with the book launch, I think just one more round of applause for the discussion and the panelists and the rich insight into the books as well. Okay, this requires strategy. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Now we are thrilled to present to you the maiden launch of Arab Worlds Beyond the Middle East and North Africa. We hope that you can join us in a countdown from 5 as we unveil the book. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We would like to invite Mr. Alhabshi to autograph the back of the book frame. Thank you, Mr. Alhabshi, Dr. Mariam Alkazemi, Dr. Claudia Youakim, Khodur Khalid, Aisha Al-Kharousi, Dr. James Sidaway, and Dr. Farid for today.
As a reminder, the pre-orders of the book are still open, and we're also actually very glad to announce that we have had an overwhelming response with the orders, and very limited copies are left. So do get yourself one. They're going really fast.
We are also happy to announce that we will be launching our 4th annual Makmul Charity Bake Sale, and this time in conjunction with Christmas and New Year. For more information, please stay tuned for updates on our website, link arabnetwork@singapore.org.
Okay, before we end today's event, we would like to actually invite a final performance, or as quoted by Prof. Farid, another element of pomp. So joined now by singer Muhammad Alhabshi for with Espousal Fusion Entertainment to mark our farewell.
امتى انا اشوفك يا كامل وصوفك؟ قل لي متى، قل لي بتسمح ظروفك. امتى انا اشوفك يا كامل وصوفك؟ قل لي متى، قل لي بتسمح ظروفك. انسى اسى الدنيا من ساعة ما اشوفك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضانين. انسى اسى الدنيا من ساعة ما اشوفك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضانين. امتى انا اشوفك يا كامل وصوفك؟ قل لي متى، قل لي بتسمح ظروفك. انسى اسى الدنيا من ساعة ما اشوفك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضانين. انسى اسى الدنيا من ساعة ما اشوفك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضانين. قل لي متى، قل لي بتعطف وتاتي يا طيب احزاني واغلى بحياتي. قل لي متى، قل لي بتعطف وتاتي يا طيب احزاني واغلى امنياتي. اهواك يا روحي في قربك وبعدك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضانين. اهواك يا روحي في قربك وبعدك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضانين. امتى انا اشوفك يا كامل وصوفك؟ قل لي متى، قل لي بتسمح ظروفك. انسى اسى الدنيا من ساعة ما اشوفك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضاني. انسى اسى الدنيا من ساعة ما اشوفك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضانين. انسى اسى الدنيا من ساعة ما اشوفك. قل لي متى، قل لي يا سيدي المضانين. Okay, everyone. غالي 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 يا محبوب قلبي. غالي 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 وذكراك دايما على بالي. غالي 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 يا محبوب قلبي. غالي 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 وذكراك دايما على بالي. غالي غالي يا محبوب والله. غالي 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 يا محبوب والله. غالي بتحمل أنا مهما جرالي جرالي في سبيل الهوى يا زين بسهر ليالي بتحمل أنا مهما جرالي جرالي في سبيل الهوى يا زين يا زين بسهر ليالي قرني بحالي ذوق المر منك حالي منك حالي ذوق المر والله غالي 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 يا محبوب قلبي غالي 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 وذكراك دايما على بالي غالي 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 يا محبوب قلبي غالي 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 وذكراك دايما على بالي غالي غالي يا محبوب والله غالي 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 يا محبوب والله غالي ايه يلا تحمل أنا مهما جرالي جرالي في سبيل الهوى يا زين يا زين بسهر ليالي بتحمل أنا مهما جرالي جرالي في سبيل الهوى يا زين يا زين بسهر ليالي مرك حالي ذوق المر والله غالي مرك حالي ذوق المر ورك حالي غالي 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 يا محبوب قلبي غالي 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 وذكراك دايما على بالي غالي 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 يا محبوب قلبي غالي 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 وذكراك دايما على بالي غالي غالي يا محبوب والله غالي 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 يا محبوب والله غالي 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 يا محبوب والله غالي شكرا شكرا السلام عليكم.
Thank you, Espousal Fusion Entertainment. One more round of applause for the wonderful entertainment as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now officially come to the end of the event. We would like to extend our greatest thanks to all attendees in person and on Zoom. Once again, we would like to extend our gratitude also to our sponsor, HMR Consultant, along with support from NUS Malay Studies Department and also our venue supporter, Asian Civilization Museum.
Before you leave, Anas has prepared delicious Peranakan Hadhrami food packs for all of you. So do remember to pick them up on your way out. Also, do not forget to observe social distancing rules when exiting from the front door. Till next time, ma'as salama.